In the annals of British crime, few names inspire as much horror as Fred and Rose West. Together, this husband and wife duo became one of the most notorious killer couples in history, turning their Gloucester home into a place of unimaginable abuse, torture, and murder. Their crimes spanned decades, leaving behind a trail of victims that included strangers, friends, lodgers, and even their own children. Fred West was born in 1941 into a violent and dysfunctional family. By the time he met Rose Letts in 1969, he already had a record of theft, assault, and suspected involvement in earlier killings. Rose, 10 years younger, was herself the product of a troubled upbringing, marked by poverty and alleged abuse. When the two came together, their relationship was toxic from the start, but their bond was also unbreakable, united by shared cruelty and a hunger for control. From the early 1970s, the Wests began luring vulnerable young women into their home at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester. Some were lodgers, others were runaways or women Fred picked up on the road. Behind closed doors, the couple subjected them to horrific abuse, including sexual assault, torture, and ultimately murder. Their cellar became a chamber of horrors, where victims were restrained, brutalized, and eventually killed. What made the case even more shocking was the betrayal of family bonds. The Wests did not limit their crimes to strangers. Several of their own children were subjected to abuse, and at least two, Heather and Charmaine, were murdered. The sheer cruelty of killing their own daughters showed the depths of their depravity. For years, the Wests were able to evade suspicion. Neighbors thought they were eccentric but harmless, while social services failed to intervene despite repeated warning signs. It wasn't until 1992, when one of their children revealed the abuse to authorities, that the full truth began to emerge. A police search of Cromwell Street uncovered human remains buried in the garden and cellar. In total, 12 bodies were discovered, though police believe there may have been more. Fred West was charged with multiple counts of murder, but hanged himself in his prison cell in 1995 before facing trial. Rose West, however, was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, ensuring she will never be released. The case of Fred and Rose West remains one of Britain's darkest crimes, a story of a couple who turned love into a weapon, their home into a house of horrors, and their family into victims of their unrelenting evil. To Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. In the 1960s, Britain was gripped by one of the most infamous and horrifying murder cases in its history. At the center were Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, a couple whose relationship became synonymous with cruelty, sadism, and betrayal of innocence. Together they committed a series of killings that would forever be remembered as the Moors murders. Ian Brady was a troubled young man from Glasgow, already fascinated by Nazi ideology and sadistic pornography by the time he met Myra Hindley in Manchester in 1961. Hindley, 19 years old and searching for meaning, quickly fell under Brady's spell. He groomed her with tales of philosophy, dominance, and violence, convincing her that they were destined to be different and dangerous. Their relationship soon escalated into something far darker than either could have imagined. Between 1963 and 1965, Brady and Hindley abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 5 children aged between 10 and 17. Their victims included Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. The killings were planned with cold calculation. Hindley would often lure the children into their car with offers of a lift or help, while Brady directed the abuse and violence. The most haunting detail of their crimes was not just the brutality of the murders, but the way they documented them. Photographs of Hindley posing on Saddleworth Moor, the site where they buried their victims, became iconic images of evil. Even more disturbing were the audio recordings found later, capturing the screams of Leslie Ann Downey as she was tortured. For years, the murders went undetected. It wasn't until 1965 when the couple killed Edward Evans and involved Hindley's brother-in-law in helping conceal the body that the truth began to unravel. Shocked by what he had seen, the brother-in-law went to police. A search of their home revealed incriminating evidence, including photographs and recordings that exposed the depth of their crimes. At trial in 1966, Brady and Hindley showed little remorse. Brady was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. Hindley was convicted of 2 and also received a life sentence. Over the years, Hindley attempted to portray herself as a manipulated woman, but few believed her claims. The public saw her not as a victim, but as an equal partner in evil. Ian Brady died in 2017 after more than 5 decades behind bars. Myra Hindley died in prison in 2002. Neither ever revealed the full truth about all their victims. Keith Bennett's body has never been found. The Moors murders remain among the most notorious crimes in British history, a chilling reminder of how love twisted into sadism can destroy the most innocent lives. Brady and Hindley will forever be remembered as one of the most evil couples the UK has ever known. 3. Colin Howell and Hazel Stewart. In the small town of Coleraine, Northern Ireland, a scandal of love, betrayal, and murder unfolded that would not be fully uncovered for 2 decades. At the center were Colin Howell and Hazel Stewart, 2 seemingly respectable members of their community whose secret affair turned into a deadly conspiracy to eliminate their spouses. Colin Howell was a dentist, well regarded in his profession, but hiding a darker side. Hazel Stewart was a former Sunday school teacher, married to a policeman. Both were married with children when they began their secret affair in the late 1980s. Instead of ending their marriages honestly, they devised a far more sinister plan: to murder their partners and make it look like a double suicide. On May 18, 1991, Colin and Hazel carried out their plot. Colin drugged and gassed his wife, Leslie, while Hazel helped subdue and suffocate her husband, Trevor Buchanan. The pair then staged the scene in Trevor's car, placing the bodies inside with a hose running from the exhaust. To the outside world, it appeared to be a tragic suicide pact between 2 depressed spouses. The case was closed, and for years their secret was safe. But behind the facade of normal life, guilt festered. Colin continued his life as a dentist and church elder, while Hazel remained a respected member of the community. Yet both carried the weight of their crimes. In 2009, Colin's life began to unravel after personal and financial troubles. Seeking redemption, he confessed to police, exposing the shocking truth that the so-called suicides were, in fact, cold-blooded murders. Hazel was arrested soon after. She initially tried to claim she had been manipulated and controlled by Colin, painting herself as a reluctant participant. But prosecutors argued she was an active accomplice, willingly helping to kill both spouses to continue the affair. In 2011, Hazel Stewart was found guilty of double murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. Colin Howell, having confessed, was also convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation he serve at least 21 years. The revelation rocked the community of Coleraine, which had once trusted both Howell and Stewart as pillars of respectability. The betrayal of faith, family, and morality was almost unimaginable. The case of Colin Howell and Hazel Stewart remains a haunting example of how passion can turn into conspiracy, and how 2 people, bound by lust and lies, chose murder over honesty. Together, they prove that sometimes love doesn't just blind, it kills. 4. Joanna and Gary Stretch. In 2013, Britain was stunned by the crimes of Joanna Dennehy, a woman whose sadistic appetite for killing was unlike anything investigators had seen. But what made the case even more disturbing was that she wasn't alone. By her side was her accomplice and partner in crime, Gary Stretch Richards, a man who enabled and facilitated her spree of violence. Together, they became one of the most twisted killer duos in modern British history. Joanna Dennehy, then 31, was described as charismatic but deeply manipulative, with a history of violence, drug abuse, and unstable relationships. Gary Stretch, a 7'3" drifter, had long been vulnerable to stronger personalities. When he fell under Dennehy's spell, he became both her chauffeur and her accomplice, willingly helping her hunt for victims. Between March and April 2013, Dennehy stabbed 3 men to death in Peterborough and Hereford. Her victims, Łukasz Slabaszewski, Kevin Lee, and John Chapman, were lured in with promises of sex or companionship before being brutally attacked. Dennehy later bragged that she killed for fun and mocked the police who were hunting her. Gary Stretch's role was not in the killings themselves, but in assisting Dennehy. He helped dispose of bodies, drove her between crime scenes, and even boasted about being part of her murderous journey. At one point, Dennehy and Stretch went on a road trip in search of more victims, during which she stabbed 2 men at random. Miraculously, both survived, and their testimony became crucial evidence. When the pair were finally arrested, Dennehy showed chilling indifference. She laughed during police interviews, joked about being a psychopath, and showed no remorse for her actions. Stretch, meanwhile, attempted to portray himself as a passive participant, claiming he was under Dennehy's control. But prosecutors argued that he had relished being part of her spree, intoxicated by her violent charisma. At trial in 2014, Dennehy pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, making her only the 3rd woman in UK history to receive such a sentence. Gary Stretch was convicted of attempted murder and assisting an offender, receiving a life sentence with a minimum of 19 years. The Peterborough Ditch murders shocked the nation not only for their brutality, but for the sheer lack of motive. Dennehy killed not for money or revenge, but for the thrill of it, and Stretch followed along, a willing accomplice to her cruelty. Together, they stand as a chilling reminder of how one person's sadism can infect another, turning a twisted bond into a trail of bloodshed. 5. David and Catherine Birnie. In 1986, the quiet suburb of Willagee, near Perth, Western Australia, became the setting for one of the country's most infamous crime sprees. At the heart of it were David and Catherine Birnie, an ordinary-looking couple whose home on Moorhouse Street would later be remembered as a place of unspeakable horror. David Birnie, a career criminal with a long history of violence, met Catherine when she was just a teenager. Their relationship was toxic, marked by domination and control. Catherine was infatuated with David, following him unquestioningly even as his fantasies grew darker. Together, they developed a murderous partnership that would come to be known as the Moorhouse Murders. Over the course of just 5 weeks in late 1986, the Birnies abducted, raped, and murdered 4 women. Their victims, Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson, and Denise Brown, were lured into their car or home under false pretenses. Once inside, they were tied up, assaulted, and ultimately killed. The crimes were fueled not just by David's sadistic desires, but by Catherine's complicity. She played an active role in restraining the victims and preventing their escape. In one case, when Nolene Patterson was held captive for several days, Catherine gave her food and even conversed with her, only to later help David kill her. What shocked investigators most was the dynamic between the two. David orchestrated much of the violence, but Catherine was not merely a bystander. Prosecutors argued that her loyalty to David was absolute, that she murdered to prove her devotion, making her as guilty as he was. Their reign of terror came to an end when a 5th intended victim, Kate Moir, managed to escape. After being abducted and assaulted, she fled barefoot into the street and alerted police. Her testimony exposed the Birnies' pattern of crimes, leading investigators to the grim discoveries inside the Moorhouse Street home. In 1987, both David and Catherine Birnie were convicted of multiple counts of murder, abduction, and sexual assault. David was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and Catherine received a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. David later took his own life in prison in 2005, while Catherine remains incarcerated. The Moorhouse murders shocked Australia, not only because of the brutality, but because they were committed by a couple who appeared outwardly unremarkable. Their crimes revealed how devotion can be twisted into complicity, and how love, when bound to evil, can turn into a pact of death. The Birnies' legacy endures as one of the most chilling examples of killer couples in history, proving that sometimes the most dangerous partnerships are those forged in both love and cruelty. 6. Ray and Faye Copeland. In the late 1980s, police in Missouri uncovered a shocking truth about an elderly farming couple who seemed, on the surface, to be living quiet, rural lives. Ray and Faye Copeland were in their 70s when they were exposed as cold-blooded killers, making them the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. Their crimes revealed how greed and manipulation can drive even the most unlikely suspects to murder. Ray Copeland had spent most of his life as a drifter, petty criminal and conman. By the time he settled with his wife Faye on a farm in Missouri, he was in his 60s and still looking for ways to make quick money. His scheme involved hiring drifters and homeless men to work on the farm. But instead of paying them honestly, Ray used them to cash fraudulent checks and then silence them permanently. Faye, often described as quiet and unassuming, was far from innocent. She played an active role in luring the men and covering up the crimes. Investigators later found that she helped compile a hit list of potential victims, and her involvement went far beyond simply turning a blind eye. Between 1986 and 1989, at least 5 men who worked for the Copelands vanished. Their remains were later discovered buried on the property, some with fatal gunshot wounds to the back of the head, execution style. Police concluded that Ray had murdered them to avoid exposure for his fraudulent schemes, while Faye had provided crucial support in planning and concealment. The couple's downfall began when one of the drifters, who narrowly escaped, went to police. A search of the farm uncovered human remains, bloodstains, and weapons that linked the Copelands directly to the murders. At trial in 1990, prosecutors painted the Copelands as cold and calculated. They argued that Ray pulled the trigger, but Faye was the strategist, keeping records, aiding in the fraud, and knowing full well that the men would never leave the farm alive. The defense tried to portray Faye as a battered wife acting under duress, but the jury was unconvinced. Both Ray and Faye Copeland were convicted of multiple murders. Ray was sentenced to death, but he died in prison in 1993 before his execution could be carried out. Faye was also sentenced to death, though her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. She died in 2003. The case of Ray and Faye Copeland shocked the world because it shattered stereotypes. These were not young thrill-seekers or desperate outlaws. They were elderly grandparents, proving that evil can hide behind even the most harmless appearances, and that age is no barrier to cold-blooded murder. 7. Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez. In the 1940s, America was horrified by the story of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, a couple whose twisted relationship led to the deaths of lonely women seeking love. Known as the Lonely Hearts Killers, they preyed on vulnerable victims through personal ads, turning promises of romance into a trap of manipulation, cruelty, and murder. Raymond Fernandez, a con man with a history of fraud, used Lonely Hearts advertisements to meet single women. He would charm them, promising marriage, and then exploit them for money before abandoning them. But when he met Martha Beck in 1947, his crimes took on a far darker dimension. Martha was a nurse with a troubled past, insecure about her appearance and desperate for affection. When she fell in love with Fernandez, she became fiercely possessive and willing to do anything to keep him, even if it meant helping him kill. Together they formed a deadly partnership. Fernandez would lure women in with his charm, while Martha, posing as his sister, helped gain their trust. Once the women were isolated, the couple robbed them and in several cases murdered them. Their victims included Janet Faye, a 66-year-old widow who was beaten to death, and Delphine Downing, a young woman whose 2-year-old daughter was also killed after witnessing her mother's murder. The sheer cruelty of the crimes shocked investigators. Beck, in particular, showed a chilling lack of remorse. She admitted to despising the women Fernandez seduced, often expressing jealousy and rage. Prosecutors argued that her willingness to participate in the killings was fueled by her obsessive love for Fernandez, making her just as dangerous as he was. Their killing spree ended in 1949 when police, acting on a tip, arrested the pair in Michigan. Evidence quickly tied them to multiple murders across different states. The case gained sensational media coverage, with headlines dubbing them the Lonely Hearts Killers, and portraying them as one of the most depraved couples of the 20th century. At trial, both Fernandez and Beck were convicted of first-degree murder. In 1951, they were executed side by side in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York. Their last moments were spent professing their love for each other, even as they faced death for their crimes. The case of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez remains infamous, not only for the brutality of their killings, but also for the psychological bond that drove them. It was a partnership built not on love and devotion, but on obsession and destruction. Together, they prove that when love is poisoned by jealousy and greed, it can become a weapon of murder. 8. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. In the early 1990s, Canada was rocked by the crimes of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, a couple whose attractive appearance and outward charm earned them the nickname the Ken and Barbie Killers. But behind the facade of good looks and suburban normalcy, the pair hid sadistic tendencies that would make them two of the most reviled criminals in Canadian history. Paul Bernardo appeared to outsiders as a charming, successful young man, but beneath the surface, he was violent, controlling, and obsessed with domination. Karla Homolka, a veterinary assistant, was described as pretty, intelligent, and compliant. When the two met in 1987, their relationship was intense and volatile, driven by mutual attraction, but also by Bernardo's escalating sadism, which Homolka chose to indulge rather than resist. Together, they embarked on a campaign of sexual violence and murder. Between 1990 and 1992, Bernardo and Homolka abducted, raped, and killed at least 3 young women: Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and most disturbingly, Karla's own younger sister, Tammy Homolka. Tammy died after being drugged and assaulted by the couple on Christmas Eve in 1990, a crime they videotaped. Bernardo and Homolka recorded many of their assaults on videotape, capturing the unimaginable cruelty inflicted on their victims. The tapes became some of the most disturbing evidence ever presented in a Canadian courtroom. In 1993, after Bernardo was arrested in connection with a string of rapes in Ontario, investigators uncovered his involvement in the murders. Karla, facing the possibility of a life sentence, struck a controversial plea deal. She testified against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence, claiming she had been an unwilling participant under his control. The deal, which became known as the Deal with the Devil, outraged the public once the videotapes revealed she had been an active and willing accomplice. At trial in 1995, Paul Bernardo was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated sexual assault. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Karla Homolka, under her plea bargain, received only 12 years in prison for manslaughter. She was released in 2005, sparking widespread anger and protests. For the families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, the crimes were a devastating loss. The revelation that Karla had helped kill her own sister only deepened the sense of betrayal and horror. The case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka remains one of the most infamous in Canadian history, not only because of the brutality of their crimes, but because of the shocking contrast between their outward appearance and their inner monstrosity. The so-called Ken and Barbie killers proved that evil can hide behind a perfect smile, and that love, when twisted by sadism, can become a weapon of destruction. 9. Michel and Monique Olivier. In Europe, few criminal couples have inspired as much fear and revulsion as Michel and his wife, Monique Olivier. Known as the Ogre of the Ardennes and his accomplice, they terrorized France and Belgium for decades, luring, abducting, and killing young girls in one of the most disturbing sprees of modern European crime. Michel was a predator long before he met Monique. With a history of sexual violence dating back to the 1960s, he was already a convicted rapist when he crossed paths with Olivier in the early 1980s. Monique, lonely and submissive, quickly fell under his control. Their relationship became a pact of dominance and complicity, with Olivier not only enabling Fourniret's crimes but actively helping him carry them out. Between 1987 and 2003, the pair were linked to at least 11 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher. Their victims were almost always teenage girls or young women, chosen for their vulnerability. Olivier would often act as bait, luring the girls into the couple's car with offers of rides or work, before Fourniret assaulted and killed them. One of their most infamous cases was the 1989 abduction of 12-year-old Fabienne Leroy, who was raped and murdered by Fourniret with Olivier's full knowledge. Another was the 1990 killing of 20-year-old Jean-Marie Darameau, a student Monique helped lure under the guise of friendship. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a long pattern of predation, fueled by Fourniret's sadism and Olivier's disturbing loyalty. The couple managed to avoid detection for years, aided by Fournier's manipulative intelligence and Olivier's silence. But in 2003, their crimes unraveled when they were arrested in Belgium after a failed abduction attempt. Under questioning, Olivier eventually confessed, exposing her husband's atrocities and implicating herself as his accomplice. At trial, the world was confronted with the horrifying details of their partnership. Fournier was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Olivier, who had lured victims and helped cover up the killings, was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 28 years. In 2021, Michel Fournier died in prison at the age of 79, never fully admitting to the scale of his crimes. Olivier remains incarcerated, still one of the most despised female criminals in France. The case of Michel Fournier and Monique Olivier is remembered not just for the scale of the killings, but for the way their relationship became a pact of death. He was the sadist, she the enabler. Together, they proved that evil can be magnified when two people choose to share it. 10. Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy. In the early 1980s, Los Angeles was terrorized by a murderous duo who became known as the Sunset Strip Killers. Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy seemed, on the surface, like an odd couple. He was a smooth-talking drifter with violent fantasies, and she was a nurse looking for love. But together, they embarked on a killing spree that left at least 7 women dead and revealed the devastating power of a toxic partnership. Douglas Clark had long harbored sadistic fantasies. He bragged about wanting to kill women and expressed obsession with necrophilia. When he met Carol Bundy in 1980, she became enthralled by him. Insecure and desperate for affection, Bundy indulged his dark desires instead of rejecting them. The pair soon began acting on Clark's fantasies, turning words into unspeakable acts of violence. Their victims were often young women and sex workers along the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. In the summer of 1980, Clark lured women into his car, where he raped and murdered them. Some victims were shot in the head, others strangled. Afterward, Clark engaged in necrophilia, while Bundy helped clean up evidence and dispose of the bodies. One of their most chilling crimes involved 2 teenage girls, Gina Nerano and Cynthia Chandler, who were murdered after accepting a ride from the couple. Their bodies were later found discarded on the roadside. Clark later described these killings with a disturbing sense of pride, while Bundy admitted to feeling jealous of the victims, but did nothing to stop the violence. The pair's downfall came when Bundy, unable to keep the secret any longer, confided in friends about the murders. When police were alerted, Bundy eventually confessed, implicating herself and Clark in the killings. She admitted that while Clark pulled the trigger, she was deeply involved in the planning, cleanup, and even some of the assaults. At trial in 1983, Douglas Clark was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. He remains on death row in California to this day. Carol Bundy, who cooperated with prosecutors, received a sentence of 52 years to life in prison. She died in 2003 while still incarcerated. The case of Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy remains one of the most infamous examples of killer couples in America. Their crimes revealed how one person's violent fantasies can corrupt another, creating a partnership where cruelty is amplified rather than restrained. Together, they turned the Sunset Strip, a place of nightlife and glamour, into their hunting ground of death. Love can be the most powerful force for good, but in these cases, it became the ultimate weapon of destruction. These 10 couples prove that when 2 people share not only affection but also cruelty, their evil is amplified. Alone, they might never have killed. Together, they became monsters. From Fred and Rose West, who turned their Gloucester home into a chamber of horrors, to Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, who hid sadism behind perfect smiles, these cases reveal how toxic partnerships can magnify violence. Some killed for money, others for lust, power, or thrill. But what unites them is the way love was twisted into complicity, passion into bloodshed. For the families of the victims, the pain was doubled, knowing not just 1 but 2 people conspired in the deaths of their loved ones. And for society, these stories are reminders that the darkest crimes are not always committed in isolation. Sometimes they are carried out hand in hand. But now we want to hear from you. Do you believe killer couples are more dangerous together than they would be alone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries every week.